Dense irregular connective tissue is thicker and a lot more randomly organized. You can see the pattern of this is just very random here. Look at the squiggly lines. They just kind of go all different direction. And this is important, okay? So I know I've said it over and over again, but structure determines function, or you could say function determines structure. So the structure here is important because the organization of the tissue allows it to undergo tension forces from different directions, from all different directions. So you can pull this in all different directions without just completely tearing it apart. It is found in the dermis of the skin and often around skeletal muscles. Elastic connective tissue is mostly yellow fibers in parallel strands or a branching network. Collagenous fibers and fibroblasts here are found between the layers. You can see the fibroblast here, and then here's your collagenous fibers, and they are kind of zigzag looking, but they are still parallel. And then you have the elastic fibers in there also. These are going to be found by attachments between bones and the spinal column, layers of the walls of hollow organs and arteries, and some portions of the heart and the airways. Cartilage is the next tissue type. It is a rigid tissue that provides support, attachments for things, protection, and it can form structural models actually for developing bones. The extracellular matrix is going to be made of collagenous fibers in a ground-like substance. Chondrocytes are going to occupy small chambers that we call lacuna. Lacuna, I think lagoon, it's like a little cavity. So we're going to have our lacuna here, and then in the middle of that you're going to have a dark spot. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's very large, called a chondrocyte. So these are important to look at and look for with connective tissue types, because one of the types, they're very small, but two of them, they're very large. And so when you see these, they look kind of like octopus suckers, and we'll talk about that more in lab. But this is how you know you're looking at cartilage, and then you got to figure out what type of cartilage you're looking at. They have a perichondrium. Remember, peri means around, and so it encloses the cartilage. These do not have a blood supply. It obtains nutrients from nearby blood vessels that are outside the perichondrium via diffusion. And so do you think these are going to heal very well? Not without blood vessels, okay? So these just do not heal very, very well. So this is why that lack of blood supply is why the torn cartilage heals so slowly, if it's going to heal at all. Hyaline cartilage is another one of my favorites. It's kind of a really pretty tissue. It is the most common type. It's got very, very fine collagenous fibers in the extracellular matrix. And so instead of having those strands that you can see, it's very glassy appearing. It's kind of pretty. This is found on the ends of bones and in many joints, soft parts of the nose, and supporting rings of different respiratory passages. One fact that's kind of interesting is an embryo skeleton actually starts out completely as hyaline cartilage, and then it's kind of remodeled and eventually replaced by bone. This is also part of the normal development and growth of bones, and we'll look at that when we look at the skeletal system. Elastic cartilage is going to be more flexible than hyaline cartilage. The extracellular matrix has a dense network of elastic fibers, so it's going to have kind of a scratchy appearance to it. The chondrocytes are fairly similar in size. They're very easy to see in both hyaline and elastic cartilage, but the difference that you're really going to look for is, do you have that glassy appearance, or do you have that scratchy appearance where it looks like you have the elastic fibers in there? This forms things like the framework for the pinna, and the pinna is the external ear or parts of the larynx. Fibrocartilage is a very, very tough cartilage. It's got a lot of these collagenous fibers. This is sometimes mistaken for muscles because it looks kind of like a muscle tissue. So that's something I want you to pay attention to, is study these and study the muscle types and look for differences that you can find to be able to help you distinguish these. You can see here you have chondrocytes, you have nuclei, which are small, collagenous fibers, and some extracellular matrix here. This often acts as a shock absorber. For example, an intervertebral disc between the vertebrae and of your spinal column will be made of this connective tissue type. It also cushions bones found in the knees. So we know we need shock absorbers there, cushion there, or the pelvic girdle. Osseous tissue, otherwise known as bone, yes, that's a connective tissue type, is the most rigid. Hardness of bone occurs due to mineral salts like calcium phosphate or carbonate. These contain flexible, though, collagenous fibers, and those reinforce those mineral components of the bone. These, of course, act as support. They protect vital structures and provide attachment for muscles. These contain red marrow, which forms blood cells. They store and release inorganic ions and salts like calcium and phosphorus. So if your body needs calcium, it will pull it from the bones. In the compact bone matrix is deposited by what we call osteoblasts and layers called lamellae. And so in lab, we're going to look at being able to identify these different parts of bone. Okay, you're going to need to be able to find lamellae, caniculi, the osteon, and you can see those here. We're going to go over those more in lab. So these form these concentric circles, okay? And that makes bone one of the easiest, if not the easiest, to identify. You have these really nice concentric circles, and then you have this central or haversian canal in the middle. So these are pretty easy to identify. Once osteoblasts are in lacuna, they're surrounded by matrix, then we call them osteocytes. Okay, so that's just a difference in location. Osteoblasts and extracellular matrix are concentrically clustered around that central canal, and they form what we call an osteon. So the osteon is the whole little circle, and we can call that also a haversian system. These central canals, the haversian or central canals, have blood vessels in them. So injured bone heals much, much quicker than cartilage because they have so much more blood supply and access to the blood supply. The next connective tissue type are red blood cells. These are also really nice and easy to identify, so don't miss these questions on your lab exam. So lastly here, we're going to look at the types of membranes that we have. We have 4 types of epithelial membranes: serous, mucous, cutaneous, and synovial. Okay, synovial. Membranes are basically sheets of cells. Epithelial membranes are usually composed of epithelium and their underlying connective tissues. So that's why this is kind of at the end of those two. They cover body surfaces and line cavities. That's very important. They cover body surfaces and line cavities, and we have the 4 types. Serous membranes, this is important, line cavities that do not open to the outside. They reduce friction between organs and cavity walls. They form the inner lining of the thorax and abdomen and cover organs. Their cells secrete what we call a serous fluid, and that's what helps lubricate the membrane surfaces. Mucous membrane line tubes that open to the outside of the body. So these open to the outside. These serous membranes do not open to the outside. These include mucous membranes. You already know most of these if you think about it. Oral and nasal cavities, tubes of the digestive system. You do have mucus in the digestive system. Respiratory, urinary, and reproductive system. These are made of epithelium and a layer of areolar connective tissue. The type of epithelium along with these can vary. And of course, if they have mucus, then they have to have goblet cells to secrete the mucus. All right, so you will find goblet cells there. Cutaneous membranes, this is the skin, what we commonly think of as the skin. This is part of the integumentary system, and it covers the body. And then we have synovial membranes that line joints, and these are made entirely of connective tissues. An example of this is the lining of the nose, and that's actually going to be a mucous membrane. I'm not sure how I jumped back on that one, but all right, so this is the last slide in this section. You got one more to go. This was the longest one. The next one, I believe, will be a lot shorter.